In the dark of night, a team of divers prepares for a dangerous expedition. Their journey will take them 60 miles offshore and a half-century back in time.
You are 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey, suspended in water so dark and so cold it feels like the inside of a freezer at midnight. Your diving light only cuts through about 3 feet of visibility. The pressure at this depth is crushing. Your oxygen mixture is carefully calculated, because one mistake in your breathing gas ratio, and you will never see the surface again. And then, slowly emerging from the black, you see it. A shape. Long, cylindrical. Massive. Encrusted in decades of marine growth, draped in collapsed fishing nets like a burial shroud. It is unmistakably a submarine. But according to every official military record ever written, no submarine was ever lost anywhere near this location. What you are looking at, officially, does not exist. That is exactly what happened to a group of recreational wreck divers in the summer of 1991. And what they eventually found inside that corroded steel hull did not just add a footnote to history. It rewrote the entire chapter. To truly understand why the discovery of this submarine sent shockwaves through the naval history community, you have to understand what it was, what it represented, and why its disappearance was so thoroughly misunderstood for nearly half a century. U-869 was a Type IXC-40 U-boat, one of the most capable and feared submarine designs produced by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The Type 9 series was engineered for long-range operations, the kind of deep ocean patrols that required endurance, stealth, and lethality over extended periods far from home ports. At roughly 252 feet in length, these submarines were considerably larger than the more common Type 7 boats that dominated the Battle of the Atlantic in the earlier years of the war. They carried a crew of between 48 and 60 men depending on the mission, 6 torpedo tubes, a deck gun, and enough fuel and supplies to operate independently for months at a time. U-869 was commissioned in January 1944 under the command of Captain Lieutenant Helmuth Neuerberg, a career naval officer. The boat was fitted, crewed, trained, and prepared for combat deployments that would take it far from the relative safety of European waters. By late 1944, the war was turning decisively against Germany. The Allied forces had reclaimed France, the Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure, and the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was losing U-boats at a catastrophic rate. Despite these losses, German High Command continued sending submarines out on patrol. U-869 and its crew of 56 men were ordered into that storm. The story of U-869's final mission is, at its core, a story about the chaos that defines the final stages of any collapsing military structure. In December 1944, U-Boat Command issued orders sending U-869 to patrol the waters around the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow choke point between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea where Allied shipping was dense and submarine ambushes had historically been effective. However, those orders were subsequently changed. German Command, concerned about the boat's fuel range and operational capacity for a Gibraltar patrol, issued revised instructions redirecting U-869 toward the waters off the east coast of the United States, specifically the approaches near New York and New Jersey. This was a common operational zone for German submarines during the middle years of the war, when U-boats had briefly terrorized American coastal shipping in an operation the Germans called Operation Drumbeat. The problem was that U-869 never acknowledged receiving the updated orders. Radio communication between submarines and shore command during wartime was notoriously unreliable, subject to Allied interception efforts, atmospheric interference, and the operational necessity of submarines maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. The last confirmed transmission from U-869 was received on January 10, 1945. In that message, the boat reported its fuel levels but gave no indication of its position or its awareness of the revised patrol orders. After that, silence. German Command, operating on the assumption that U-869 had received and was following the original Gibraltar orders, concluded after the boat's disappearance that it had been lost somewhere in the waters near southern Spain and North Africa. In February 1945, American forces reported sinking a German submarine near Gibraltar. That kill was attributed to U-869, the case was closed, and 56 names were added to the growing list of sailors lost at sea. For 40 years, nobody questioned it. Not Allied naval historians compiling their records. Not German researchers reconstructing the Kriegsmarine's losses. Not even the families of the men who had gone down with the boat. The official story was tidy, and nobody had any reason to look underneath it. John Chatterton and Richie Kohler were not historians, academics, or naval researchers. They were wreck divers, obsessive, technically gifted, and relentlessly driven by the particular madness that possesses a certain kind of person who cannot resist descending into dark water to find things that have been lost. In the summer of 1991, the two men were among a group of divers using sonar equipment to locate and explore uncharted wrecks along the seafloor off the New Jersey coast. The waters off New Jersey are, as any wreck diver will tell you, a remarkable underwater landscape. Centuries of maritime traffic, wartime naval operations, storms, and shipping disasters have left the ocean floor littered with the remnants of vessels large and small. It is not unusual to find wrecks in these waters. What is unusual is finding a wreck that matches no known record. When the sonar aboard their dive vessel returned an image of a long, sleek, unmistakably submarine-shaped profile resting at a depth of approximately 230 feet, roughly 60 miles off the coast of Point Pleasant, New Jersey, the divers were intrigued. On their first descent to the wreck, conditions were punishing. Strong currents, poor visibility, and the ever-present danger of entanglement in the abandoned fishing nets that had settled over the hull made early exploration treacherous and frustrating. But what little they could see was enough to confirm they were looking at a military submarine of considerable size. What they could not find, anywhere on the exterior of the vessel, was a single identifying marking. No hull number. No insignia. Nothing. This absence was deeply strange. Wrecks in these waters are typically identifiable. Historical records are generally comprehensive enough to match a discovered vessel to a known loss. But according to every Allied and Axis naval record consulted, no submarine had been lost in this area. The wreck, as far as official history was concerned, did not exist. Chatterton and Kohler nicknamed it Yoo-Hoo and committed to solving the mystery. What followed was one of the most remarkable sustained investigations in the history of maritime archaeology, conducted not by any government or institution, but by a small group of civilian divers operating on personal obsession and borrowed time. Over the course of several years in the early to mid-1990s, Chatterton, Kohler, and a rotating cast of fellow divers made repeated descents to the wreck, each dive carrying serious risk of death. Technical diving at 230 feet using mixed breathing gases is not a hobby for the faint of heart. The divers had to follow meticulous decompression schedules, pausing at precise depths on their ascent to allow absorbed nitrogen and helium to safely leave their bodies. Failure to follow these schedules precisely could result in decompression sickness, a potentially fatal condition in which dissolved gases form bubbles in the blood and tissues. The interior of the wreck added further dangers. Narrow, corroded passageways, unstable debris, and the constant risk of silt disturbance that could reduce visibility to absolute zero made penetration dives in the submarine extremely hazardous. Despite all of this, the divers kept going back. And gradually, the submarine began to reveal itself. German-language gauges on instrument panels. Metric calibrations on measurement devices. Equipment configurations consistent with Kriegsmarine submarine construction standards. All of it pointed unmistakably to a German U-boat. But which one? Without a hull number or identification plate, pinning down the specific vessel seemed nearly impossible. Until one dive produced an artifact that changed everything. It was a butter knife. A simple piece of personal silverware, tarnished by decades of submersion, with a name engraved on its handle. The name was Horenberg. That name, cross-referenced against crew rosters for German U-boats that might conceivably have been lost anywhere near the American coast, led the divers to George Horenberg, a confirmed crew member of U-869. Working with naval archivists and cross-referencing records from the Deskamag AG Weser shipyard in Bremen, the facility that had constructed U-869, the divers eventually matched engine component serial numbers recovered from the wreck against the submarine's original manufacturing documentation. The identification was confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. The ghost submarine sitting 230 feet below the surface off the New Jersey coast was U-869, a boat that had officially been destroyed thousands of miles away, in the waters near Gibraltar, for decades earlier. In the process of researching U-869's crew and history, Chatterton and Kohler made contact with a man named Herbert Gostjuski, a German naval veteran who had been assigned to U-869 in the final weeks before its departure on its fatal patrol. Gostjuski had trained alongside the crew, learned the boat systems, and was fully prepared to sail with them when fate intervened in the form of a serious illness. He was pulled from the crew manifest and hospitalized shortly before U-869 departed for what would be its final voyage. When the divers found him decades later, Gostjuski was an elderly man living a quiet life in Germany, and he was completely unaware that the boat he had narrowly escaped had been found off the American coast. Like everyone else, he had spent his entire post-war life believing the official account that U-869 had gone down near Gibraltar. The photographs the divers brought him, the artifacts they showed him, and particularly the butter knife bearing Horenberg's name, a crewmate Gostjuski remembered clearly, shattered everything he thought he knew about what had happened to the men he had trained alongside. Gostjuski became a quiet but invaluable contributor to the ongoing investigation, providing personal recollections of the crew, confirming identifications, and offering contextual details about the submarine and its personnel that no archival document could have supplied. He died in 2005, never having physically visited the wreck that had claimed his former crewmates, but having contributed meaningfully to the process of finally giving those men a proper historical record. As the identification of U-869 was confirmed and the story attracted growing attention from naval historians and documentary filmmakers, the exploration of the submarine's interior became increasingly detailed and, in many respects, deeply affecting. The Atlantic Ocean had preserved the wreck with startling completeness. The combination of low water temperature, minimal light penetration, low oxygen levels, and the sealed nature of many of the submarine's compartments had created conditions that slowed biological decomposition and physical degradation far beyond what might typically be expected after 5 decades of submersion. The crew quarters were the first area to truly confront the divers with the human reality of what they had found. Narrow bunks, stacked in the impossibly cramped style that characterized life aboard a German U-boat, still held the remnants of bedding. Personal items remained in lockers. Books, their pages swollen and fragile from water exposure, but in several cases still legible, sat where their owners had left them. The mess area retained plates and utensils, scattered in the manner that suggested not a careful stowing for combat, but the ordinary disorder of interrupted daily life. In one area of the wreck, a locker had come open, spilling its contents in a slow drift that had settled over the years into a small constellation of personal effects. Among them, reportedly, were leather gloves, a harmonica, and a carefully sealed deck of playing cards. These were not military equipment. They were the small private luxuries that young men, far from home and well aware of their own mortality, chose to bring with them into the steel tube that was both their weapon and, ultimately, their tomb. The control room retained many of its instruments, some shattered by pressure changes following the submarine sinking, but others still fixed to the walls, their German language labels and metric dials bearing silent testimony to the precision engineering of a machine built for war. Uniforms, some still bearing insignia and name patches, had survived in a condition that was, to the divers who encountered them, almost unbearable in its intimacy. The torpedo room raised the question that would drive the central debate about how U-869 met its end. Several of the torpedo tubes remained sealed. In a submarine that had allegedly been destroyed in combat, this was a significant anomaly. If the crew had time to engage an enemy, why had they not fired? And if they had no time to respond, what does that say about the nature of the attack? The question of how U-869 was destroyed remains genuinely contested, and the competing theories illuminate the extraordinary difficulty of establishing historical truth at the bottom of the ocean. The United States Navy's official position, maintained for decades, is that U-869 was sunk on February 11, 1945, by the combined attack of 2 American destroyer escorts, the USS Howard D. Crowe and the USS Coiner. According to naval records, these vessels detected acoustic signals consistent with a submerged submarine off the east coast and prosecuted an attack using depth charges. The kill was credited to U-869 in post-war assessment of naval records. From the Navy's perspective, the case was closed. But the physical evidence from the wreck tells a more complicated story. The pattern of damage observed on U-869 is more consistent, in the assessment of many independent analysts, with an internal explosion than with the external pressure wave and fragmentation effects typically produced by depth charge attacks. The most severe structural damage appears to originate from within the forward section of the submarine, and the deformation of the hull metal in this area is inward rather than the outward deformation characteristic of external blasts. This observation has led many wreck diving experts and independent naval historians to conclude that U-869 was most likely destroyed by what mariners call a circular run. A torpedo guidance system malfunction in which a fired weapon, rather than traveling in a straight line toward its intended target, curves back in an arc toward the submarine that launched it. Circular runs were a documented hazard for submarine crews on multiple sides during the Second World War. Several confirmed cases of submarines being sunk by their own malfunctioning weapons exist in the historical record. If U-869 had fired a torpedo in preparation for an attack, perhaps against a vessel it had detected in the approaches to the American coast, and if that torpedo's guidance mechanism had failed in a way that curved its path back toward its source, the crew would have had almost no time to respond. The explosion would have come from the direction of their own forward tubes. The sealed remaining tubes would be entirely consistent with a crew that fired one weapon, or attempted to, and was destroyed before they could fire again. The full truth may never be known with certainty. The competing evidence is real but incomplete on both sides. What is clear is that the Navy's original attribution of the Gibraltar sinking to U-869 was wrong, and that the boat's actual fate unfolded not in the warm waters of the Mediterranean, but in the cold, gray Atlantic within sight of the American shore. The story of U-869 is, on one level, a story about one submarine, one crew, and one of the countless operational tragedies that accumulate over the course of any major war. But the reason it continues to resonate, the reason it has inspired books, documentaries, and ongoing discussion among naval historians and diving enthusiasts, is that it is also a story about the limits of official history, the persistence of truth, and the profound moral weight of the unknown. For 50 years, 56 men lay at the bottom of the ocean with no correct record of where they were. Their families had no accurate account of what had happened to them. The historical record of the naval war, compiled with care and diligence by serious researchers on both sides, contained a significant error that nobody had the means or the motivation to correct. It took 2 civilian divers, operating on personal curiosity and considerable physical courage, to go find the truth and bring it back to the surface. That process of recovery mattered not only for historical accuracy but for something more human. The personal effects found inside U-869, the books and the playing cards and the harmonica and the boots still lined up against a wall, remind us that every statistic in a casualty count was a person. The crew of U-869 were young men, most of them barely past adolescence, living inside a machine designed for killing, surrounded by the evidence of their own ordinariness. They argued over meals and played music and carried reminders of home. They were not abstractions. They were people, and they deserved to be found. Modern underwater technology has transformed what is possible in terms of recovering and documenting these kinds of lost historical sites. Side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, advanced mixed-gas diving techniques, and high-resolution underwater imaging systems have opened up portions of the ocean floor that were functionally inaccessible to previous generations of researchers. As these capabilities expand, the potential to locate, identify, and properly document wrecks like U-869 grows accordingly. But technology alone is not sufficient.